This week on Inside Olympia, we tackle two of the most complex problems facing Washington: homelessness and substance use disorders. Is government up to the task of combating these dual crises? What solutions are under consideration in the state legislature? And do Democrats and Republicans share any common ground when it comes to how to respond?
From the TVW studio, it's Inside Olympia with host Austin Jenkins.
And welcome to Inside Olympia. Deaths from drug overdoses are rising sharply in Washington, and substance use disorders are also a factor in homelessness and crime. In our second half, we'll talk with a pair of state lawmakers about what the legislature can do to address this crisis. But first, it's been said that Washington state has an exceptionally high rate of homelessness. Over the past decade, the number of unsheltered homeless people in the state has shot up 70%. This coincided with a roughly 50% increase in rents. At the same time, the state has spent billions to combat the problem, and yet the signs of visible homelessness are everywhere. So what will it take to turn the corner on this issue? Is there any hope of a solution? Joining me now is Democratic State Representative Strom Peterson, chair of the Housing, Human Services, and Veterans Committee in the State House, and State Representative Andrew Barkis, the assistant ranking Republican on that committee. Welcome both of you to Inside Olympia. Thanks for being here.
Good morning.
Let me just frame the conversation by giving you a little bit of a personal backstory. As a reporter in 2005, when I was early on covering the state legislature, I went to the Wenatchee area, to Wenatchee, and did a story then about the legislature's goal. The legislature's requirement that all 39 counties in the state come up with a plan to reduce homelessness by 50%. That was actually an amended goal. The original goal was to eliminate homelessness within 10 years, and I realized that wasn't going to happen. So cut homelessness by 50% in every county in the state. Now we sit here in 2022 talking about explosive growth in homelessness. Representative Peterson is the chair of the committee. Can you just help us understand, how did we get here, and how did we go in this period of time from trying to essentially eliminate or dramatically reduce this issue to a seemingly out of control situation?
Well, thanks, Austin. And first, I just want to give a quick shout out to my colleague, Andrew Barkis, and the work that he's done on substance use disorder, which is your next segment coming up, and really the incredible work that he's done around that. So I just want to thank him for that work. I wish I had an answer. If anybody has that answer, give me a call, because that is one of the big questions. It's not only how do we get out of this, but also what are the factors that got us here. And as with anything that's complicated, there is no kind of single easy answer to how we got here. I think it's a number of things. One, I think substance use disorder is certainly a big part of this, but that it's also coincides with affordable housing. You know, the number one reason for homelessness is a lack of affordable housing. This is happening all around the country. This is not a Washington specific issue. And also, I think we're paying the price for, both nationally and here in Washington, for decades of underspending when it comes to supporting behavioral and mental health, again, substance use disorder, and some of those underlying causes of homelessness. We just, as a nation, have not been spending the appropriate money for our most vulnerable families and most vulnerable neighbors, really since the early 80s. So we're kind of paying that price, and we're trying to figure out a way out of it now.
Representative Barkis, this is certainly years, if not decades, in the making. The Great Recession certainly didn't help. And we are, as the governor often says, to some extent, victims of our own success. This is a growing state. We've had, we have very high-paying jobs, a very active housing market, but that does squeeze people. But as you think about that little bit of history, at one time the legislature, I'm not going to be fooled again, I'll tell you that. The legislature said it was going to eliminate or reduce homelessness by 50%. And we'll get to the new goal in a minute. But how did we get here?
Well, first of all, I've been enjoying working with Representative Peterson over the last several years, and we've worked on a lot of good policy. But I'm going to have to say, I believe we have been part of the problem. And when I say we, I think about the legislature as a whole. Austin, what we've seen is a radical change in the last couple of years on so many different fronts, whether it's our criminal justice system, some of the police reforms, drugs, the tolerance of drugs, legalization, all the different things. And we know that statistically, so many people that we see on our streets are suffering from some form of chemical dependency or addiction, leading to mental health issues. When I got here about 6 years ago, I started looking into this. It became one of my things in housing. And I was just digging around in preparation for this. And I went back and I found a project I did looking at all the legislation just over a 10-year period from 08 to 18. Dozens and dozens and dozens and dozens of pieces of legislation to deal with homelessness, and the corresponding hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars to accomplish that goal that you stated. The reduction of 50%. We've created agencies and departments, et cetera. It's worse. So, the problem is that we have to start dealing with this literally one person at a time. We have to put the resources where they can best do their work. In my opinion, that is in what you're going to be talking about, and that's chemical treatment, detox, permanent supportive housing, different things that we can do. But it's going to take that will to start making those steps, to actually start moving these people from the street to back into life. And I think that's been the problem. We've tried to work around the periphery of this, and we keep, I hate to say kick the can, because I do believe we've done some great things. I do believe we've done that, but it's a combination of things. To look at all the fronts, Rep. Peterson and I agree. We have a housing supply issue. Is that the cause of the people living in tents right now? Could be a percentage, but we have created we're our own worst enemy when it comes to relieving the housing supply because of the regulatory burdens, all the things we've done. We keep putting forth legislation from both sides of the aisle to get at this, and we don't seem to make a difference in actually doing that. So then we start pointing blame. Oh, it's the rents are too high. It's the landlord's fault. It's evictions are causing this. It's a multiple issues that are causing this. And we can pinpoint those. We've spent a lot of money pinpointing them. Now we have to take the steps. And, I'd be happy to talk more about that. What I think, what we've looked at on how to address this person by person, encampment by encampment, and what would be needed in order to get the resources to start helping these people get back into life.
Well, Representative Peterson, I'm not convinced that we even have a real handle on how many people are living currently in a status where they don't have stable housing. It seems like the point in time counts are woefully inadequate. As I understand it, they don't count people in jail, they don't count people in hospitals, they don't count people who don't want to cooperate with the counters. So do we even really know what the scope of the problem is in this state?
No. I mean, you hit it. I mean, the point in time count kind of does give us a bit of a baseline, because even though the numbers aren't accurate, I guess for lack of a better term, they've been the same inaccurate numbers over the years. So we're getting a slice, and and kind of so we know that it's growing, but no, we don't have a full grasp of what's going on. I don't know how, and I don't think any state does. I don't know if any country around the world does. But that's, I think, back kind of to Andrew's point, we know that the problem is massive, so we have to get started at the problem, both on the kind of very upstream end, which I know, again, a lot of the work that Andrew's done with substance use disorder and mental health. So we need to keep people from falling through those cracks and ending up on the streets, and then those issues are just exacerbated. But right now, in this kind of crisis situation, we need to invest a whole bunch of money and a whole bunch of human capital in saving people's lives, literally saving people's lives and getting them off the street. That's one of the reasons that I have asked the capital budget for a $500 million injection of funds into housing. The way we get out of homelessness is get people into homes, right? So we need to deal with the immediate crisis, but also we can't take our eye off of the the upstream reasons of why people are falling into homelessness.
Well, in response to Representative Barkis's criticism, for lack of a better word, of what the approach has been, and not to take away from the efforts that have been made and the billions of dollars that have been put into this problem, but as you size this up and think about kind of what the next 5 to 10 years might bring, are we talking about scale? Does this just need to be scaled to meet the problem? Does the state need a different approach than it's been taking? Both?
If that's
I'm
towards
sorry,
me,
yeah,
yes.
Representative Peterson.
I think both. I think the amount of work that's been done, again, in the last couple of years in a very bipartisan manner, dealing with investments in mental and behavioral health, investments in substance use disorder, have been game changing since I first came to the legislature, which I think I showed up a year or two before Representative Barkis. But again, we're making up for a lot of lost time. And the problem is, part of it is the opioid epidemic, but you put that on top of the methamphetamine epidemic that never went away. That acute crisis is like nothing this country's ever seen.
Yeah.
And that kind of substance use disorder, that has not happened in this country to that kind of scale.
Well, Representative Barkis, there's no silver bullet. There's no overnight solutions. There's a lot of factors that have contributed to this. This is complex. I mean, nobody's arguing that. We use the term crisis, but I also observe that we don't treat this like if we had just had an earthquake or we had just had a hurricane blow through, not that we have hurricanes here. If we had a bunch of people displaced because of a natural disaster, you could imagine that the state and FEMA would step in, and there would be, and we saw it after Katrina. Sure. Nobody thought that the Katrina housing was a great solution, but at least there was an effort to get people into shelter. Why are we not responding, at least in the short term, at scale like that? I asked the governor about the National Guard, and he said that's just not realistic or feasible.
Great question. But let me go. I just want to go back. I don't know if I would call it criticism. I would call it more fact. You just have to look at the data. And if you want to talk point in time and you want to talk about all this, when that first RV showed up on Ensign Road, not too far from where we're sitting right now, why didn't we address that first RV when it showed up?
And that was right here, just for people who aren't familiar with it, that's a road that leads to St. Peter's Hospital in Olympia that became clogged with RVs, and it impeded emergency response getting to the hospital.
Became clogged. You should see it today. Dozens and dozens and dozens. It's unreal. But why didn't we address that first one that got there when it was one, right? And go help that person, find out what their story is, and do what we got to do. To your point, 2 years ago, I wrote a letter, and many of my colleagues signed on, to the governor to ask him exactly that question, Austin, because you could see from his bedroom window the Deschutes Parkway camp that was growing by leaps and bounds into one of the largest homeless encampments in the area. And I asked him specifically, why don't we take appropriate steps like we're doing right now with COVID? We don't need an earthquake, Austin. We have been going through 2 years of a pandemic. We have learned massive lessons on how to do this. We're still under emergency powers. He could make, with a stroke of his pen, decisions today to get at the homeless issue without legislation, because he's done that on a lot of other things. So why don't we take those lessons learned? We've seen quarantine type of situations. We've seen field hospitals be put up. We've seen all these different things. We saw CenturyLink Field turned into a giant hospital. So why don't we take the resources, the money, the ideas to do that? And that's where you get into the political will. People will say, well, you can't go down and ask the guy on the corner and remove him because you're going to take away his rights. Why would you want to take away his rights? I don't want to take away his rights. I want to help him. I want to get him off the street. But instead, we come up and we say, hey, we've got a couple different pathways for you. And the guy says, no, I'm good here. And we move on. We allow him to stay there. So we have to take these bold steps. We're looking at legislation again to create the intergovernmental coordinating services, blah, 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 to do another agency, spend about $10 million a biennium to staff another agency, $10 million. proposed a proviso last budget for $10 million to help with right-of-way cleanup for our local communities. It never made it in the budget. You see, there's a difference, I think, that comes into the politics, and it comes into, what is that methodology that we want to take? And I think we need to look at the lessons learned from the pandemic. And if this crisis is at the episode or epidemic level that it is, why don't we use that same methodology to deal with it?
Well, so let me put this back to Representative Peterson in the sense that on the one hand, there's people who are living in really dangerous, unsanitary conditions, and there's that sort of humanitarian factor. And then there's people who are seeing this and thinking, this doesn't seem right. Why doesn't government do more? Where are the out-of-the-box ideas? Where is the response at scale to the problem? But the flip side of it, maybe there is a reason why some of what Representative Barkis just suggested isn't happening. Can you give us a little bit of a reality check or a different perspective here on why it's not easier, for instance, not to sweep camps, but to get people out of camps into something, at least on a temporary basis, that's more safe, secure, and sanitary? What's the reason that can't happen more quickly?
Well, I think actually to Representative Barkis's early point, one of his earlier points when it comes to some of the impediments to doing this, sometimes we have to ask our local governments to be better partners, to be able to more easily cite emergency tiny villages. There's a company in my district that manufactures incredible, very quick to put up, safe, secure housing. And they're doing work all over the country. They are doing work here in Washington, but oftentimes they're running into issues, either finding places to site a tiny village camp or finding regulatory burdens in front of them from a lot of local governments that don't want those tiny villages cited in their town. There is a lot of, well, this is a problem, but it's not our problem. It needs to be somewhere else. It's a downtown Seattle problem. It's a downtown Everett problem. But I mean, Representative Barkis knows that it's in every single corner of our state. And so, yes, I agree with that FEMA type response. I'm working with this company and others to try to create that emergency quick, get somebody out of a tent, get somebody in a shelter that they can lock the door. And just that ability to lock the door and secure your stuff has incredible benefits for somebody's mental health and obviously their physical health if they're not in the elements. So there are opportunities and missed opportunities that we have, we've dropped the ball over the years. Mm-hmm. There's no doubt about that. I can't disagree with my good friend here. But let's, and we're not pointing fingers, and I don't think Representative Barkis is either, that we have to move forward. There are solutions. They are painful, they are expensive, but that's what we have to do. And that's why I'm proud to be, chair of this Housing and Human Services Committee. So that's the other side, it's the human services side, to make sure people are getting access to the services that they need and deserve. That's been another issue, again, for the last 40 years.
Well, let's talk with the balance of time. We have about 9 minutes left about what is possible in a short 60-day legislative session with, less than half of the balance of that session left to go here. It's a supplemental budget year. The state, though, is in a fairly good fiscal position, so there might be some money to spend toward this. From each of you, I'd like to hear, I know you can't solve this problem overnight, but what do you think would be the most effective thing this legislature could do towards addressing, taking the next step towards addressing this? Representative Barkis.
Well, I think, when we look at that approach, we just have to go back to one thing. We have to somewhat remove the choice. If we put all that, we set those things up, and then we go out and we start working with people, you have to remove that choice that says, no, I don't want to go there. And that's part of the problem, Austin. Part of the problem is when you're dealing with addiction and drug and crime and everything else, you've got a whole nother subculture that's developed and been allowed to develop. So we could build the beautiful tiny home, and I agree on that. I agree with transitional and temporary, and it's transitional by the very nature. but you gotta get the people there. You can't just say, no, that's okay, it's over there, but if you want it.
So what would
To
the
the point where-
policy be that would force the, you know, for lack of a better term, what the carrot and the stick approach?
Well, that's probably beyond my pay grade a little bit with the AG, and I'm sure that we could look at the legislative aspect of it. You know, there's a lot of discussion about the Ninth Circuit Court and that Boise decision, and we can't do this and we can't do that. And there are parameters within there, but it hasn't been tested or pushed to the point where we've actually done it. We've just been poking around the periphery on this. And I think with the governor's broad emergency powers, if they're still in play, which they should be done, but if they're still in play, we should look at that, explore that. And maybe Representative Peterson and I can talk further about that with these local communities. I've talked to local communities. There are phenomenal organizations doing great work. So to your point about this session, I'm actually working with former Speaker Representative Chop and Representative Schmick and others on a House Bill 1866. And this is about what is called permanent supportive housing. Now, this is one piece that both Representative Peterson and I agree that is part of that. So when you do get people into this program, then we've got a place for them to go. And this is something that stands up some funding and some extra stuff. But the component that's exciting to me is I met a gentleman down, his name is Craig. He runs coastal community action down in Aberdeen, highly successful program, getting people off the street, huge success rate because they're doing the casework. They found this pathways. They found a way to get people into this program and transition, even if they don't have a unit for them to go into, they start to work with them to transition them off the street. Do they need substance abuse, mental health, everything else? That excited me. This piece of legislation, we found a way that we could incorporate that into it. So now we're working together, bipartisan way, trying to find out how to incorporate some of the system that's working there broader to the entirety of the state, because what they found, Austin, is that casework is key, because there's dollars that come in that they can help the people, and then they work on this whole every aspect of their life, and they stay with them. And this is something else we did in substance abuse, some of the stuff out of the Blake decision last year, where we have these navigators that stay with people. There's a much higher success rate instead of just saying, hey, here's a check, here's something here, go ahead and go. Then you have that recidivism. You have that circle of people just continuing in the cycle of homelessness or addiction. So there are some pieces. I know we're going to debate how much more money we put into this, how much of that surplus is going to go to more stuff. We must focus on our housing crisis with practical legislation. We have that opportunity. There are pieces in front of us right now. We need to get them solved in a bipartisan way, because we continue not to do that. We continue to get good pieces and they don't go anywhere. And then we leave session thinking, oh, we did good because we put another X amount of dollars into the housing trust fund. We're never going to build our way out of this problem with public housing. It's one component. We must look at the private sector in a broad thing to get at the supply issue.
Okay. Representative Peterson, you mentioned the letter you wrote to the Capital Budget Committee. Kind of extraordinary, if you ask me. I don't know that I've seen this before. Number of state lawmakers writing to the chair of that budget committee saying, please put $500 million into the capital budget, supplemental capital budget for affordable homes and other solutions to homelessness, including at least $100 million for the Housing Trust Fund, which builds affordable housing. And essentially what you were saying is, please spend even more than the governor proposed in his budget. So in addition to that, what do you think the most important thing this legislature could do in a 60-day session on this front?
And again, I don't know, maybe Andrew and I need to get locked in a room and sort this stuff out. I mean, I think he hit it on the head when you talk about permanent supportive housing, and those, three words: permanent. So not transition, what we need obviously to get us there. Supportive, that's kind of where the money talks, right? We need staff, we need trained staff. We have an incredible shortage, again, going back for decades of underinvestment in training medical professionals here in the state of Washington, and again across the country. And housing, those are the three things we need. Those are complicated, they're expensive, but that is part of this ask of the capital budget. We can't just build it and then just expect people to move in. We need the staff and the support to make sure that people can navigate into changing their lives. I'm with Andrew 100% on that. Again, we do have issues with kind of freedom of choice. Some people may not want that, but the vast majority of people that are living on the streets are looking for a way out of that. And if we can give them that supportive housing, and then it becomes permanent, That's how we get our way out of this. But it's going to take some time. It's going to take some dollars. And to Representative Barkis's point, it's going to take a lot of bipartisan effort. And the bill that he mentioned is one of those great pieces of legislation that can move that needle.
Just a couple minutes left. I'd like a closing thought from each of you, and I'll prompt you this way. So I mentioned that back in 2005, the goal was to cut homelessness by 50% in each county in Washington. Prior to that, the goal had been to eliminate within a decade homelessness. I won't put you on the spot with a goal, but what's a reality check? If you were setting some sort of a goal today, and you were looking out 10 years, and you wanted to be realistic with the public, what's a reasonable expectation? I realize you're not going to eliminate, and you're probably not going to reduce it by 50%. But what would be your aspiration, if not your goal, over the next decade?
Well, that's tough, Austin. I think that putting percentages on things is, we've seen how well that's worked over there.
Right. As I said, I'm not going to be fooled again.
I think if we can move 1 to 20, 100, 1,000 people off the streets, in short order in the next year, we're making a dent. We need to have that political will. We need to address these homeless encampments. We need to set up the systems. I would add to, if we could do anything in this legislative cycle, I love seeing that money go, but we need the most robust substance use detox facilities, training that we've ever seen, because this problem has been created, and it's such a huge piece of it. I'd love to see some of the surplus money going towards that. We have the methodology to do that. But I think, Austin, I think that you're hearing this from local leaders, you're hearing this from Seattle. I think people have finally reached a point where the public and the community leaders have all said that we've got to stop. This has got to stop. It will never end. There will always be substance use and homelessness in some form, but to this level, it needs to stop. And so we need to start person by person and just start making a dent in this. And it needs to start today. And I know it is. I know there are organizations right now, as we speak, doing what we're talking about. In the legislature, we just need to be able to come alongside them and support that.
Okay. Representative Peterson, final word very briefly.
I think part of what Andrew and I can do, our fellow legislators, is really add, and I think we have been, add some humanity to this. It's very easy to be angry as you're driving down the freeway and you see a tent encampment and have that visceral reaction. But these are our friends and neighbors. These are people that at one point were living in an apartment building or living in a home, had a job, and that something happened and that changed. And we have to remember that these are people living on the streets. These are our friends and neighbors. It can happen to anybody. And if we can inject more of that humanity, then we can bring more and more partners along to do just what Andrew said, is start making a dent person by person, encampment by encampment, and keeping people out of going down that path in the first place.
Okay. Representative Strom Peterson and Andrew Barkis, both of the Housing, Human Services, and Veterans Committee in the State House. Thank you very much for joining us. Much more to discuss in the future.